will continue that immunity through adulthood. So if a child survives malaria, and it is indeed a major killer, he can look forward to immunity that he can get infected, but his body will resist serious infection. And if an African, for instance, grows up in the malarial area and gets this immunity and then leaves to go study in the US or England, within 3 to 4 or 5 years, he will lose that immunity, come back to Africa, and be susceptible again.
Thank you. Yes, that's absolutely right. And when the metaphor I use in the book is that immunity to malaria is like a suntan. So you keep it going while you're exposed, but then once you stop being exposed, it just fades away.
Two issues. One, I'm surprised that you have not, in your discourse, talked about the impact of increased human population on the spread and growth of this disease. Human beings creating habitats are ideal for the spread of mosquito. Would you comment on that?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the amazing thing about malaria is it's carried by this mosquito, and we know where these mosquitoes live. We know what kind of habitats they like. Entomologists have figured all this out. But it's not like a grizzly bear where you can just avoid the places where the grizzly bear lives. You know, you can't just avoid where the malarial mosquitoes live because we create these habitats just by virtue of the things that we do as humans, by building dams, by blocking up water, by creating uneven land where puddles will collect. All these things create ideal habitats for malarial mosquitoes. So we kind of create the habitats that they need as we kind of go along, which is why malaria has been such a big problem during wartime in particular, because we're gouging up the land and creating mosquito habitat as we go along.
My second thing is metaphysical, really. The theory of the transmigration of souls. To what extent have you been influenced, your curiosity about this parasite, which changes shapes and forms? Is it possible that your curiosity has been aroused by this phenomenon?
Are you suggesting that I was a mosquito in a previous life?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, you touched on it briefly, but I was wondering, what was the history of success in the industrialized world, Italy and the southern United States? You mentioned DDT, but was it also there was no secondary species that didn't like the coyotes or bears in South Carolina or something? How did we and the Italians defeat it?
That's a great question. I have like a couple chapters in the book that go into more detail. But in the U.S., it was a series of different things, and we paved over half of our wetlands. So that got rid of a lot of mosquito habitat right there. We stopped living near water bodies where we were near sort of soggy land where mosquitoes breed because we stopped using rivers and waterways for trade and transportation. So we moved away from mosquito habitat. We got rid of mosquito habitat. And then we also started living in different ways with screened windows, better housing generally. And as we sort of did the economic uplift of the rural South, the rural poor, which was really the habitat of malaria, malaria kind of declined with that. So by the time DDT came online in this country, malaria was already, near vanishing by the time we did our DDT blitz in this country, which is in the early 1950s. So it was a series of changes. It probably took about 100 years to do it here in the States.
But there was no wild animal reservoir that it
of parasites, no. That's one of the things that has helped us actually in Europe as well, that the mosquitoes that carry malaria in parts of Europe will bite animals as well as human beings for their blood meal. So you can divert them. If you start getting, like in England, what happened is they changed their agricultural system, so they had more legumes and other crops to fodder for their livestock, so livestock took off. And as the livestock population grew in England, the mosquitoes started diverting, and instead of taking their blood meal from humans exclusively, they also were taking their blood meals from cattle and sheep, and those are dead-end hosts for the parasite. So that really helped in parts of Europe in ending malaria. And there was actually a saying among malariologists in that era when they figured this out, that a cure for malaria might be just a pig under every bed.
Dead end meaning that they can't go through the 7 stages?
Exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I was hoping you could expand a little more on what you're saying about the net campaigns, and there seems to be either either the net campaigns are a bit oversimplified or there's a disconnect between the science and the fundraisers. And I'm especially curious because at the beginning of your speech, you seem to be saying that your own family thought that the net was the way to save your life when you were in India.
That was not a treated net, so that was just a regular little mosquito net. And it saved me from pest mosquitoes, too, because there was very pesty mosquitoes in India at that time, where we were. So yeah, the insecticide-treated bed net campaigns now, I mean, I think they're going to do a lot of good. I mean, we're already seeing some declines in some African countries. I mean, whether it's connected to the net campaigns or not, I think that's still a little bit of an open question, actually. But certainly the momentum's there. What worries me is the usage rates being so low. And, people who give out these nets, then they go back and do surveys and say, well, did you sleep under your net last night? And maybe half of people say yes and half say no. And then you also have to take in consideration who's doing the asking. So if my Aunt Edith gives me a vase and then comes back and says, oh, did you use that vase, Sonia? And I'll say, oh, yes, I used it, So these are gifts we're giving for free, and then we're asking them if they used it. I think there's real questions even with the 50% number of usage. So I think we have to, but I think we're learning from that. So, we can do more education, more cultural awareness, more, all of that, all of those. Education has to go along with the net distribution. But the trick then is, the reason we did nets to start with, as opposed to all the other things we could have done, is because nets are cheap and easy. And now we have to add on the education. That's not cheap or easy. So then you wonder, well, wait a minute, why did we pick nets again? Because I think it could be different in different places. In some places, maybe nets are the right idea. In some places, maybe what we really need are community health workers, who can teach people about malaria. Maybe what we really need is cheap drugs. Maybe we really need to talk to the traditional healer in that area. It could just be variable. We've settled on this one thing. So I think now we need to kind of stick with it, because there's like warehouses full of nets all over Africa. So thank you.
Hi, I wanted to ask you about the testing for malaria, the new kits that are available. Because one of the problems in Africa is that people take malaria pills even if they don't have malaria. Mm-hmm. They feel sick, they take malaria pills. They don't take them in the right dosage. So can you talk a little bit about those test kits?
As far as I know, those rapid diagnostic kits are only used in sort of emergency areas. They're not considered highly reliable, but it's not something I've looked into that deeply. But certainly, presumptive treatment is a huge problem. It's not, and it's something that even the WHO is saying everyone should do. For years, just if you have a fever, it's like, you have a fever, take one, chloroquine and call me in the morning. And that was what it was for so long. So changing that to what we need to do now is a lot more diagnosis, because the drugs are more expensive. We can't just use them like that anymore.
I had a rapid test in Kenya for my son, and it was so, wonderful to have, because you could tell right away. And he said it was 98%. I don't know whether he was making that up, but it was a 98% effective test. And if that's low cost, that, along with bed nets, would seem to be a good start, at least to keep down the incorrect usage of the drugs.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that definitely is part of the WHO campaign now, is to get better diagnostics out there.
We have time for the last two in line.
I have a totally non-scientific question. We know the disease as malaria, which presumably comes from the old Latin, bad air, or from the swamps. I'm curious what other cultures refer to this disease as.
Well, I know paludism was what it was called in sort of French languages. In terms of other, I really couldn't answer that question. I haven't heard. I know malaria entered the English language from the Romans called it malaria, and that was actually not considered the name of the disease. It was more considered the cause of the disease, that it was the bad air that would give you the fever and chills.
Okay, so it doesn't have some mystical connotation or devil connotation or whatever from other cultures?
Oh, well, actually, I know in some African countries, certain kinds of malarias are called spirit fevers. And those are the kind, like cerebral malaria, which is a complication of falciparum malaria, which often leads to death. So that's called spirit fever in local languages. So there is definitely some connections there.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Just one last question.
Hi, my question is about what you see or what you encountered in your research as the role of churches and faith communities in fighting malaria. I know that there are a lot of fundraising campaigns in the U.S. that are tied to various denominations, and just if you encountered any of those in your research and what you see is the effectiveness of those. And then also in the malaria-affected communities with pastors and spiritual leaders being able to help potentially spread some of those messages and affect some of that cultural change you were talking about.
Yeah, I think the churches have been hugely involved in the malaria fight, as you mentioned. The thing that I'm always reminded of David Livingstone, who went through Central Africa and and he was famous for controlling malaria. I mean, everyone else, they went into Central Africa and just dropped like flies. And he said it was because of his good moral values and his, his exercising every day and things. But he also took really high doses of quinine when he was sick, and he always wore his boots. And malaria mosquitoes like to bite you on your ankles, and they like the smell of feet. And he always used a bed net. So the history of the church and malaria goes back a long way. So I'm reminded of that. But yeah, you're right. They're doing a ton of work now, and it's exactly those kinds of local actors who need to be thinking